Medfield TV.
Okay, well, we have Wesley, Fedak, and Elizabeth Athanasiadis here to present the Morse family history. There's student curators. We have too much gray hair in the Historical Society membership. I'm trying always to get more younger people in it. And part of that program is having high school seniors on board each year. And part of their gig is doing the presentation. This year they've chosen to talk about the Morse family. Aren't you glad? Do you know much about your ancestry?
Excuse me?
Do you know much about your ancestry?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe you should get here doing some. Well, I mean, if you have anything to add to the presentation,
right,
feel free. Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So we'll get started here with the first Morse we'll be talking about. And his name was Samuel Morse. He was born in Boxhead, England in around 1585. And he didn't leave England with his wife until about the 1630s. And at first he actually didn't even live in Medfield, but first he settled in Dedham, where he was part of the Dedham Covenant signer, and didn't move to Medfield until about 1649. A few years later, he was living in Medfield during the King Philip's War, and it is believed that his house was one of the first homes that was burned in that war. And Samuel was actually one of the saviors of the town of Medfield, as he was able to alert everyone in the town about the impending attack. And the story goes that his house was located by Main Street and Pound Street junction, and it is said that when on the morning of the attack, Samuel Morse woke up and he was going about his daily routine, taking care of all of his yard work and all of his morning businesses that he had to attend to, and he actually saw the feet of an Indian sticking out of his hay barrel, and he looked at it. He ran back inside. He got all of his family members together, told them what he saw, and with them, he was able to flee to one of the 3 garrisons that Medfield had. And on the way while he was going there, he looked back and saw his house burning in the distance. And so he was able to successfully get all of his family members out. No one died in that from his family. But unfortunately, not everyone survived from this attack on Medfield. And when he got to the garrison, he was able to warn the town, sound the alarm of the King Philip's attack, and he was able to let the town know of the attack a lot sooner than they would have found out if Samuel Morse did not do what he did and alert the town about the attack. Furthermore, pretty interesting little factoid, I guess. He has 3 very significant presidential descendants, who all, in some ways, shared his bravery and courage of warning the town of Medfield. And those are Calvin Coolidge, William Taft, and George H. Bush and George W. Bush, all very notable figures in the history of the United States, and all related to the original Samuel Morse, who eventually died in 1654 and died in Medfield, where a lot of his family also died and was born.
So here's some more on Samuel Morse. So he came here on the increase with the rest of his family, came here with his children, Thomas, Elizabeth, John, Daniel, Joseph, Samuel, Sarah, and Mary. And he was married to Elizabeth Jasper in England in 1602. This is a picture of the increase right here. And at his death, he left everything to his wife. And once she died, he passed that down to his children. So in his will, it read, Samuel Morse's will read, I, Samuel Morse, being sick and weak in body, but of good and perfect memory, for that little estate of outward things, which the Lord hath been pleased to bestow upon me, whether they be movable or immovable, as houses, lands, chattel, household stuff, etc., I will and bequeath them all unto Elizabeth Morse, my dear wife, to enjoy, possess, and make use of her life during the term thereof, and after her decease, divided amongst my children, John, Daniel, Mary, and Mary Boland. Lastly, I constitute and appoint Elizabeth, my beloved wife, the sole executrix of this, my last will. And his estate was appraised on November 27th, 1654 for 124 pounds. However, this wasn't the extent of his property. He did like get rid of a lot of it before his death. He sold a lot of it to some of the Wheelocks and some of the other settlers in Medfield.
All right, here we have one of his children, John Morse, who was born in 1608. So he was born in England before he eventually moved over to the United States. And he did not originally settle in Medfield. He rarely visited it. He actually was a main person in Dedham, and we're mentioning him in a slide about Medfield history because it shows the extent of the Morse family, not only to Medfield, but to Dedham, Boston, even to England. Well, John was a child of Samuel Morse and Elizabeth Morse, and when he moved to Dedham, he was actually admitted among the proprietors of Dedham, and in around 1636, he was granted land, which across from his brother Joseph. However, his brother died soon after from being run over by a wild cart. So his brother died, but he stayed in Dedham, and eventually, once his brother died, he decided to move to Boston. So he sold his land, and he went to Boston to become a tailor and try to expand his wealth and his knowledge to the people in Boston. So he made quite a good living in Boston, but he decided he wanted more of a life. So again, he moved back to England with all of his clothing that he made as to make money for the cost back. He traded it for goods, food, help, and he made his way back to England. However, eventually he returned to Massachusetts, where he was able to marry Annis Chickering, who later changed her name to Annis Morse, and it spread his family tree throughout Boston and England when he moved to both those places. And later in life, he died a successful death, making quite a bit of money, as his estate was enumerated for 385 pounds, which back then was a lot of money. I'm not sure the exact translation to how much it is today, but several thousands of dollars just for his estate. And eventually he was buried with his brother Joseph and Daniel, Daniel and Samuel in the Vine Lake Cemetery in 1657, where his grave still stands today.
So the next Morse we have is Daniel Morse, who was he was John's brother, another child of Samuel. He was born in 1613, and he actually didn't come to the colonies with his family. He came later and settled in Watertown in 1635. So there was a house assigned to him in Dedham in 1636, since he had family there. But he was pretty prominent in other surrounding towns, such as he was the first selectman of Sherborne, and he was the chosen one of a commission to trade with the Native Americans. So he was chosen to trade 4,000 acres of land in what is now Ashland. So he sort of gained Ashland for us, I guess, from Native Americans. He traded it for an equal quantity. He gave them parts of Sherborne, like the northwest and central parts, which is now Sherborne again. But and and also 300 bushels of corn. So that's interesting. And he paid 3/4 of the corn to the Native Americans. So I guess he sort of bought Ashland. And supposedly he married Lydia Fisher. However, there's no exact records of their marriage. But there are like sort of stories and like instances where they were together, but there's no exact record of their marriage.
Next we have Mary Morse, who was one of the later children of Samuel Morse, and she was indeed the daughter of Elizabeth Morse as well. She was born in 1620, which means she also was born in England with her parents, but with her siblings, but she was born much later, and she too was able to move over to the United States with her family, and in 1642 she married Samuel Bolin, which changed her name to Mary Bolin. And Samuel was already living in Massachusetts area. However, there's no exact notable records of anything Mary has accomplished in life besides her family, her baptismal time, her death, her children, her husband. However, her husband, Samuel Bolin, was a far more prominent figure in the town of Sherborne, Medfield, Dedham, and surrounding areas. And Samuel Bolin was the son of Samuel Bolin Sr., who was born, and Samuel Bolin was born in 1617 in Dedham, England, not to be confused with Dedham here, and he came to Massachusetts as early as 1634, just about almost 10 years before he married Mary Morse, and he was in Watertown, Massachusetts, around the same time as Samuel Morse, the father of Mary Morse, was, and he was at a general court sitting for a tract of land south of the Charles River, and 12 men were granted this land. He himself was one of them, as well as Samuel Morse. So they both were part of the men who received some land south of the Charles River, which connects Samuel Morse to Samuel Bolin and to Mary Morse. Later in life, he eventually did own a house in Medfield in about 1646, where it was declared that he was the first European with a family in this town, supposedly, which made him one of the original settlers, along with Samuel Morse and others. And his house was actually built prior to 1651, and it used to stand north of Phillips Street, but it does not anymore. It's no longer there, because his house was burned down in the King Philip's War, along with most of the town in Medfield. But he was not killed. He made it out alive of that. However, because his house was burned down, he and his family needed to live somewhere else, so they actually moved to Sherborne and became tenants of his brother-in-law, of Mary's brother, Daniel Morse, to make money and have a living. And eventually, this house that you see in the bottom right corner is near Brush Hill Road in Sherborne, where it's rumored that that was the general location where his house stood. Many renovations have been made. It looks completely different from when it did when he lived there. However, eventually he did move back. He was able to move back to Medfield once he worked with Mary's brother for a while and was able to raise enough money to do that. And so he moved back to Medfield, and he was a tenant of Captain Hull's farm, and had land assigned to him west of the main central common area in Medfield, and opposite the hat factory, I believe, or around that area. Not exactly certain of the location. However, he was eventually one of the selectmen in Medfield. In 1682, he was chosen for this, and he became a deacon prior to 1689, which means he was able to create quite a living out of himself after having his whole house burned down, have to start from scratch basically. He later died in Medfield on January 16th, 1692. The same year Mary Morse died. However, she died much later in that year than Samuel Bolin, so she was a widow. She did not remarry after Samuel. And the tombstones are both still standing in Medfield. Up there in the top right corner is one of the tombstones. And together they had 10 children, which surprisingly, it was not uncommon during this time for families to have a lot of children and to remarry if the husband or wife died. And that's why they had 10 children together, but all of them lived in different parts of Medfield, Sherborne, even extending out to Boston. Some of them moved.
So Samuel Morse Jr. was a great-grandson of the original Samuel Morse. There wasn't really much about him that was very significant, or he didn't really partake in any notable events, but he was one of the few to be to born and die in Medfield, so I guess he was a lifelong Medfielder. He married Abigail Babcock, who changed her name to Abigail Morse in 1692, and in the same year, it was the same year that the Salem witch trials started, which is just like an interesting thing to add. And Abigail married before Samuel, but was widowed, and like Wesley already said, it wasn't uncommon for them to remarry, since they did have like a lot of children, and they were usually is there anything else on? Yeah, we thought we should add someone else besides one of the original ones that we had already talked about, but there wasn't really much.
And then we come to Jacob Morse, who was a sixth generation Morse, the great grandson, I think that was enough greats, of Samuel Morse. And he was one of the last few Morses directly related to Samuel Morse, who was actually born in Medfield. A lot of the other descendants of Samuel Morse were born in Sherborne, Dedham, but Jacob was actually born in Medfield. However, in 1745, he is buried in the Newfane Cemetery, as he died in 1818. And from Medfield, however, Jacob Morse eventually moved to Princeton, Massachusetts, where he lived until 1787. And so quite a few years before he died, he was able to make a notable living, so to say, compared to the other people during that time, where he was able to work side jobs and raise enough money to later move to Newfane, Vermont, where he eventually settled on a notable farm size, nothing too small, but certainly big enough to create a good living. And that farm actually was owned by his grandson, Samuel Morse, who is a seventh generation Morse. He's an example of someone who's not born in Medfield. He was born in Vermont with Jacob. However, he has ties to places Dedham, Sherborne, and the other towns that we've mentioned about where the Morse families have settled and have contributed their time and efforts. Eventually, Jacob Morse married Mary Kingsbury. However, she died quite recently, or quite rapidly after they married, and he eventually remarried Sarah Hawes. They both changed their name to the last name of Morse. And with Sarah, he had all of his children. He had no children or direct descendants with Mary because she died early, and they were not able to bear children. However, with Sarah, he had all of his children, and the Morse family name was able to be carried on through Sarah and Jacob together. They had I believe they had close to 7 children. None of them directly related to Medfield, but they still had ties to towns nearby. And it just proves how the Morse family is beginning to populate as they're starting to now appear in Boston, notably, Sherborne, Medfield, Dedham, again, same places. But it's just interesting to see how how a family who originated in England and eventually migrated to the United States was able to spread their name and their wealth throughout so many towns in quite a quick format too. It's only been about 200 or so years for 6 generations to spread throughout the Northeast, and some Morses have even moved to were even rumored to have moved to California and Ohio, where they there started a family, and however they changed their names because most of them were women, so they didn't keep the Morse name, so there is no direct Morse name in their in the history, but they are still related to Samuel. So it's interesting to see how the spread of the Morse family impacted the different towns and different communities within this towns that they moved to. And those are the main Morses who affected Medfield and Dedham and surrounding towns. And however, most of you guys probably know of a more famous Morse, Samuel FB Morse. He is not related to the Samuel Morse who we talked about, who settled in Medfield. However, since he has Morse, he is part of a Morse line, just not the one that not the one in this presentation. He is probably the most notable and famous Morse by the last name of Morse in the country. For his painting, he was an inventor. He invented the telegraph system and the Morse code system, which will be showed in more in depth in this little clip we have.
The old joke poses the question, who's buried in Grant's tomb? The answer, of course, is Ulysses S. Grant. But if you ask who invented Morse code, you may be surprised by the answer. In the 1830s, Samuel Morse is a struggling art professor at New York University. Troubled by financial failures, he turns his attention to science and sets out to build a device that can use electricity to send messages through a wire. In 1837, he gives a public demonstration of what he's developed.
It's a very early version of the telegraph. Morse had the idea for some sort of electronic instantaneous communication, but he was an artistic person and not a technical person.
Morse doesn't know a great deal about electricity. His first telegraph is a complicated, cumbersome device that doesn't work very well. But it inspires a young man named Alfred Vail, who attends Morse's demonstration.
Vail was 30 years old, and he's sort of searching for his place in the world. He'd gone to NYU and had studied to be a minister, graduated during a very depressed time in American history, and minister positions weren't available. So he was kind of looking for a purpose in life still.
Vail is the son of a wealthy ironworks owner in Morristown, New Jersey. Impressed with the demonstration, he offers to help Morse improve his telegraph. More importantly, he convinces his father to finance the effort and provide him with access to the ironworks' well-equipped workshop. For months, Vail works feverishly to make Morse's machine more efficient. Morse is busy with other commitments and rarely visits.
Originally, Morse is expected to be a major part of those developments, but he ends up not really showing up at Speedwell for very much of the work. Alfred does almost all of the technical development here.
Vail virtually redesigns Morse's telegraph, making the machine more efficient and reliable. But he also makes an even more valuable contribution. Morse has created a complicated code system, allocating a number for every word. When a signal comes through, the operator has to flip through thousands of pages of the code book to find the number that matches the word. The system is slow and cumbersome, and Vail believes he can do better.
Vail, in just a few months, comes up with the idea of a new way to send the message, and that would be letter by letter. He actually has his assistant, William Baxter, help him. They go through newspapers and count letters to see which signal should be the shortest for the letters that are used the most.
For example, they discover that the letter E is the most commonly used letter, so they give that the shortest signal. a dot.
That's where the dot and dash alphabet that we associate with the telegraph was actually born.
All this work results in a patent for the electromagnetic telegraph machine, which is issued on June 20th, 1840. The patent details both codes, but Vail's system proves easier to use and is quickly adopted. Why does Morse get the credit instead of Vail? Because Vail's name is not on the patent.
In 1837, they signed a contract with Morse, the Vail family does, that everything that will be developed under Morse's name. The Vails were in general in awe of Professor Morse, I think, both because of his age being some 20 years older than Alfred Vail, and also because Morse was a fairly established person.
When the telegraph takes off, Morse becomes rich and famous. But Alfred is not so lucky. Forced to sell his shares prior to the boom, he dies a poor man.
Well, I think it is a sort of bittersweet story. Vail finds a lot of fulfillment in the work. It uses his mind and engages his imagination in a way that nothing else he has done before this did. I think if you take any sort of moral out of the story, it would be looking at Vail's ability to find fulfillment in the work without the recognition of the world.
So the most famous Morse actually isn't as famous as we might know, even though his name is attached to the Morse code and he was inventor of the telegraph system. He's done almost little to no work to actually help make that a useful invention. And Alfred Vail, unfortunately, the mastermind behind all of this, gets no credit. No one remembers him throughout the ages as Morse. His name is attached to the actual usage of the end system, Morse code. So he's famous for something that he hasn't really contributed to in any great way.
Our last honorable Morse mention he has no connection to the Medfield Morses either, but when I did find him, I was actually very excited because I thought he did have a connection, so I was like looking through like his genealogy, and then ended up not, but I thought it'd be really interesting to include him anyways as an honorable mention. So this is John Vanakkam Morse. He was a key figure in the Lizzie Borden trials in Fall River, Massachusetts, which if you've lived in Massachusetts ever, you know mostly about the Lizzie Borden trials. Basically, it was Lizzie Borden was a girl who murdered her entire family in Fall River, Massachusetts in the 1800s. So, but she ended up not guilty, even though most believe she did do it. But he testified against her. He was the brother of Andrew Borden's first wife, which is Lizzie and Emma Borden's mother. So he was their uncle. But he visited the Bordens the day before the trial, or before the murders. But he moved to Illinois, and he lived there for about 25 years, and he didn't come and visit ever. And then all of a sudden, the day before the murders, he just showed up unexpectedly. So everyone sort of assumed he was the murderer. He was originally the main suspect just because his presence was so unknown, and there was no he never revealed a reason for why he did come to visit. He just showed up unexpectedly. And it was said that him and Lizzie may have had an affair, and that he was the mastermind behind the whole thing, and that was basically the whole trial behind him, which was sort of scary to think of because he was her uncle. But it was he also arrived in town without many possessions at all. He only had one outfit, what he had on him was what he had. So it seemed like he wasn't even planning on staying for long, which was it just all together, it just seemed very suspicious for his reasoning for being in Fall River. But it ended up, he came out also not guilty and ended up testifying against Lizzie Borden, though clearly that didn't work because she was also not guilty. So that's all we have on the Morse family of Medfield. Do you have any final thoughts?
Is there anyone in the audience who might have anything to add on Morse
I'm Samuel Morse. He's my 11th great grandfather.
Wow.
And my 8th.
Sharon and I are related.
Peter, right?
Right.
Yeah, you're from Renton, is that?
Right.
Was there,
This is Daniel. Daniel Lyon.
did he live in Renton?
No, he lived here, was the third settler, sort of original settler here, and then he moved to Sherburne. He bought that big tract of land around the Fountain Pond. And there's 3 Daniels
One
and
of 2 L's.
Obadiah.
Yeah.
They all live right in that area. 210 and 77. And then Abner, which we moved to Nova Scotia, and that's where we come from.
It's my line went to Nova Scotia.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So, and then, so there's
What was the pull in Nova Scotia?
And
Land? Okay. So free.
I don't know if
came back here in the 20s.
I don't know if you do, but one of the Morses moved back to England. And, it seemed, but he came back here, and I wondered if the English Civil War began in 1640, he may have gotten there just in time for the war. But I don't know.
No. He moved back to England about 1650, early 1650s, so he missed it, but yeah.
He lived in Boston in 1654, and then later moved back to England.
Any other questions or comments? Oh. Thank you.
Medfield TV. Community shows.